When the BBC World Service poll came out in 2011, which was research targeted to see how one country views another, a surprising result came out. The Philippines had become one of the most pro-Japanese countries in the entire world, where over 84% of Filipinos had viewed the Japanese positively and only 12% expressed and feeling any negative sentiment towards Japan. This result was, to some people, quite shocking and, to others, quite normal. But to the degree why we have stated that this might have been shocking is that less than a century ago, during the onslaught of the Second World War, Japan has been known as the one who occupied and broke the Philippines, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties, and all of these is until today seen as amongst the worst occurrences in the modern history of the Philippines. Yet, as sad as it seems, the growing influence of the Japanese people on every Filipino seems to be growing every day. Even following studies have proven that the initial poll done by the BBC was becoming more true than ever. How could this be? How can a nation view another nation so positively despite the fact that there had been fatal occurrences that happened in the past? Well, to understand all these, we must first go back to the farthest history, all the way around the 15th century, when Japan's presence in the Philippines had started to rise. It was a time that descendants from the land of the rising sun had reached the Philippines and had been living and dwelling amongst the local people. With such a huge start in their presence, the Japanese had found that the Philippines was a somewhat strategic place for trading. Hence, this trend of immigration from Japan to the Philippines has been a key figure in history to what paved the way for the growing presence of Japan to the Philippines. And in simpler terms, it just meant that Japanese to the Filipinos felt more of a family due to the history that they shared with each other. Fast forward across the next centuries, the trend of Japanese living in the Philippines has continuously grown. And as the 20th century slowly creeps in, and at a time when the Japanese were known as among the global superpowers, things have started to change at the very top of the ladder for the Japanese. They had gone on to approach the former occupants of the Philippines known as Spain and had offered to buy the Philippines in 1894 for £40 million. And as it did not happen, it was not accepted. 40 or so years later, the day that changed the history of the Philippines and Japan started. On exactly the 8th of December, 1941, the invasion of Japan in the Philippines had begun. Aerial bombardments, troop deployment, and the arrival of a new regime had resulted in the destruction of monuments, infrastructures, lives, houses, and so much more had occurred. This would go on for 3 years, a slight yet changing and demanding time. As time went on and the war had stopped, Japan had a change in its system, or rather, it needed to realign its entire views according to the United States. With the US presence in Japan standing as a profound figure, it has leaned in differently going forward. It went on to become a so-called democratic nation, just like the US, and had gone on to sign diplomatic treaties across the world, and one of which was the Philippines. But the times were still difficult during these moments. Hate and grief were still towards Japan from the Philippines. Even yet, some remaining Japanese soldiers have even stayed in the Philippines and have caused trouble even though the war has already ended. But Japan had seemed to have changed and had seen a trend so dramatic in its views, from an authoritarian to a democratic government. By the 1950s, diplomatic relations have seen a trend that has been slowly rising, and war reparations were finally concluded. And as the world exits its turmoil phase, the Philippines and Japan had found a diplomatic footing with one another, and Japan, like in the old days, would continue its path to investments and trade. It would come back to the Philippines for business purposes. This would be evident by the end of the 1950s until the 21st century, which saw a tremendous number of Japanese investors and companies come to the nation and either establish their brands or invest in local companies. This is how Japan went from breaking and disrupting the Philippines and helping build it out. It first started off with the two nations' governments, where they had exchanged ties and signed treaties to ensure that they succeeded in a smooth peace period. Thereafter, as Japan's economy booms rapidly during this time frame, it would go on to expand its economic capital gains to other nations, one of them becoming the Philippines. One of the many ways Japan has done so is through its program known as the Japan International Cooperation Agency and its framework known as the Official Development Assistance, or or ODA for short. This framework would go on to help not only the Philippines, but several nations across Asia. It would also emerge by the 21st century as amongst the largest development funds around the world. Quite a turnaround after it was just a few decades ago that it was a warmongering nation to become one of the leading sources of development assistance. This ODA fund has in large part become so huge that in 2020, Japan's overall portfolio of contributions to the economy of the Philippines amounted to over $30.7 billion, which made them the single largest source of investments and aid to the Philippines. Furthermore, since the later years of the ODA's inception from 1985 to 2017, Japan has also chosen the Philippines to become one of its largest countries to place its economic capital. From 1960 to 2018, the OECD, which has the data on how much investments were laid out across the decade-long ODA, shows that this time frame amounted to over $39.4 billion. Now, as to why Japan chose the Philippines to store or it places its large investment numbers is rather arguable, as one may note that it is all because of the fact that it has been one of the nations it disrupted in the past and might be just using this form of investments as an apology. Some may even argue that it is for the use of capital gains, investing in a developing country and profiting from them years or decades later, but these might all still be put up to the question, as they have also had a fierce history upon other nations and are also tied out to investments around the globe. It might be better to presume that it is because the two nations do indeed hold a relationship that has been going on for centuries, which is because the two nations, the Philippines and Japan, have a strategic geographical landscape. But regardless of whatever it may be, we have at least seen time and time again the resilient investments of Japan into the Philippines. We have seen the emergence of Japanese-led infrastructures that pave the way for the construction of railways, bridges, and even buildings that are known to impact the past, present, and the coming future. Moreover, even the ambitious program led by the President Rodrigo Duterte, which is known as the Build, 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 has been noted that Japan was among the largest sources of funding for this $180 billion framework, where even former President Shinzo Abe had pledged over 1 trillion yen back in 2017. It is even worth noting that regardless of what has happened to the nation, whether there is a political crisis, economic depression, or a calamity, Japan was always among the first nations to lay out rescue plans for the Philippines. Even the Asian Development Bank, or ADB for short, a regional development bank that was fostered because of Japan, had been a large source of investments and loans in the Philippines, paving the way for over $6.4 billion of assistance by 2020. In fact, ADB is even headquartered in Mandaluyong, within the capital region of the Philippines. Because of all these, and presumably so much more, the Philippines and Japan have created a fostering relationship that really went from distrusting each other to being reliant on one another, whether that is through economic means, political means, or even human capital. Filipinos' view as one of the most pro-Japanese in the entire world might not, after all, be an understatement. It will be, in fact, a fact that may hold true for the coming decades or even centuries. As Japan's economy and the population continue to falter, it is inevitable that one of the nations that would rise up and help Japan's economy would be the Philippines, considering they are both geographically close to each other and foster a long-lasting relationship that goes down in history.